My name is Olivia Keene, age 38. I served 19 years in uniform, 12 of those years in special operations, and the last 3 at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I've dragged the broken, I've held the dying, and I've written more condolence letters than I dare remember. And today, I stood trial, not as a soldier, but as a daughter. In front of the Pentagon chiefs, my father said I was a liability who shamed the uniform and put others at risk. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't look at me. He stood in his own Class A uniform, ribbons across his chest, like silent accusations. The same man who once whispered to me as I earned my Ranger tab, "You make our name proud, Olivia." Now, he stood at the heart of the Joint Military Oversight Court, his voice calm, his tone clinical. She endangered the integrity of command. Her record is overstated. Her actions were emotional, impulsive. She cost us more than she ever protected. His words didn't pierce me. They splintered. Because they weren't just attacks. They were revisions. Rewrites of every risk, every breath, every scar I carried. I stood motionless in my own Class A. 3 medals pinned to my chest. But it wasn't the medals that mattered, because when the silence grew too loud, when their narrowed eyes whispered judgment, I did something I never thought I would. I lifted my shirt, just enough, and I showed them the rib scars, shattered, dark, twisting across bone like a signature of pain. They weren't fresh, but they weren't faded. And every man and woman on that panel leaned forward as if pulled by the silence that followed. I looked at them and spoke, just once. From that night in Al-Hudaydah province, when I dragged 3 men out under mortar fire, while bleeding, while alone. That's all I said. I didn't cry, didn't shout, and just like that, the silence wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the institution. My father's case collapsed before he did. He didn't faint, but something in his eyes dropped. Something that once held command gave way to something that looked like regret. And I realized in that moment, scars speak louder than rank. We wore the same uniform, but we sat in opposite seats. Same blood, same flag, different truths. The courtroom lights were cruel, white, and indifferent. They didn't care about honor or betrayal. They just exposed what was hidden. I looked at my father, Major General Walter Keene, decorated, respected, feared in some circles, and I thought, does he still see the little girl who used to oil her boots beside him? Or does he only see a disruption to his legacy? My earliest memory with him wasn't a bedtime story or a birthday gift. It was the day he showed me how to disassemble an M16. I was 10. He said, every part has a function, and if one part fails, the whole system suffers. That's what command means. Today, he applied the same logic, and I was the part that failed. He spoke of risk management, unit cohesion, emotional compromise. He never once mentioned Al-Hudaydah, never once mentioned the 3 lives I dragged from that jungle compound. The bleeding, the blackout, the helicopter that landed just in time to find me unconscious, ribs shattered. But the Pentagon chiefs, they had the report. They had the classified footage. And still, the morning of the trial, a redacted summary had leaked to the press. My inbox exploded before I'd even entered the courtroom. Whistleblower or liability? Hero turned rogue? Keene versus Keene. Father testifies against daughter. It was no longer just a tribunal. It was a war of optics, of narratives. And I knew. I wasn't just fighting for my name. I was fighting for every soldier who ever got told they were too much, or not enough. The tribunal room had no windows. But in that moment, I could feel the world watching. And sitting across from my father, I didn't feel small. I felt precise, focused. Because if they were going to call me a liability, they were going to have to look my scars in the eye first. I was raised by a man who believed that feelings were the enemy of strategy. General Walter Keane, my father, was a war planner long before he was a parent. He believed in precision, order, and discipline, not lullabies or heart-to-hearts. When I was 9, he made me memorize the entire NATO phonetic alphabet. By 11, I could field strip a Beretta blindfolded. By 13, I had my first training schedule. No sleepovers, no journals. Emotion clouds judgment, he'd say. Clarity wins wars. But I love the military too, just not the way he did. Where he saw hierarchy, I saw humanity. Where he demanded silence, I learned to listen. He taught me how to fight. I taught myself why we fight. I excelled. Top of my class at West Point. First woman in my battalion to lead a night extraction in hostile terrain. My name was becoming known. And so was his, again. He saw me as an extension of his legacy. Another Keane in the War College records. Another star pinned through family veins. When the Strategic Operations Post in Washington opened a slot, he pulled every quiet string to place me there. It was a promotion most soldiers waited decades to earn. High-level clearance, influence, power, a stepping stone to Pentagon command. But I said no. I didn't want to be a chess piece in a room of predictable men. Didn't want to win wars on paper. Didn't want to be the daughter who played the part, while he orchestrated the play. And I told him that, directly, calmly, respectfully. I want to serve on the ground, not on the carpet, I said. His silence afterward was longer than any monologue he ever gave me. He never forgave me for it. He didn't yell, didn't argue, he just pulled back. From that day on, every call got shorter, every nod colder. He stopped, asking where I was stationed. Stopped mentioning my name when he briefed command. To the world, we were both decorated officers. But in private, we were estranged at attention. I used to think I'd feel regret, that turning down the opportunity would haunt me. But what haunted me more was the look in his eyes. Not disappointment, but betrayal, as if I'd stolen something sacred. I didn't reject the seat to spite him. I did it to be myself, to be more than a symbol on his resume. But my father didn't want a daughter who thought for herself. He wanted a soldier who followed orders, even when they weren't spoken. We were wheels up at 0400, 9 of us, strapped into the back of a Blackhawk, flying toward Ratanakiri with the kind of silence that only comes before something you can't quite name. I was the mission lead, tasked with extracting a civilian engineer being held near the border. My orders were clear. My gut wasn't. Ratanakiri isn't as secure as they're telling you, our liaison whispered before we boarded. He had the look of a man who had seen enough to know when to keep his voice low. I nodded but said nothing. The map said it was fine. Command said it was fine. I'd been trained my whole life to follow the chain of command. But I'd also been trained to listen to the terrain, even when the map said no. Before boarding, I unclipped the micro backup recorder from my personal kit and slipped it into my comm rig. The device was barely the size of my thumb and could mirror every audio feed from our radios. I knew even then what I would do with the data. If we made it back alive, it would not stay on me. It would not stay in any official military drive. I would hide it where no one would think to look, somewhere so ordinary that even a general would overlook it. I had already chosen the place. Behind the photo frame I kept in my apartment, the one of my team during training for Viper Echo. It was the only photo I'd never taken down, even when I was angry at the world. As the Blackhawk shuddered in the wind, I repeated the same phrase I'd been taught since childhood. Every detail must be accountable. The flight was short, too short. When we landed, the jungle swallowed us. Ratanakiri was green, damp, and alive with sounds that didn't belong. Eyes up! Move clean, I ordered, my voice even. We advanced in formation, weapons raised, the thick canopy closing over us. It didn't take long for the first wrong detail to show itself. The GPS overlay was off by nearly a kilometer. That never happened. Ruiz, my comms officer, frowned. "Ma'am, either the satellites are drunk or someone's been feeding us ghosts." I told him to keep moving, but my stomach tightened. By the time we reached the compound, I knew the maps had lied. The terrain told the truth, and the terrain was angry. It started with one snap, not the sharp crack of a bullet, but the soft, almost casual snap of a twig that shouldn't have been stepped on. I turned just in time to see something flash from the tree line. Simmons didn't even scream. He dropped forward, red already blooming across his back. Beckett jerked his rifle to the left, but then the ridge exploded. 1 second we were 9, the next we were 7, then 5. I don't remember the sound so much as the pressure, like the air sucked out of my lungs replaced with dust and urgency. Carter was gone. Ruiz was screaming. A blast hit left. My shoulder slammed into bark. Then pain exploded through my side. At first, I thought it was just a bruise. But then I tried to breathe. It was like swallowing glass. No, like inhaling razor wire. Each breath scraped its way down, dragging fire and blood with it. I touched my ribs and felt wet warmth, too far back to be sweat, too thick, too fast. "Keen, you're hit!" Torres shouted from the front. I didn't answer, didn't have the air, didn't have the time. Ruiz was crawling, his leg twisted at a wrong angle. Blake had a chunk of metal in his thigh, trying to keep Beckett conscious. The engineer was gone, hauled off with Michaels toward the fallback point. We had no stretchers, no medivac, no light, just jungle, just blood. I crawled first to Ruiz. The mud was slick, and my palms slipped. Once, twice. I remember my hand landing in something warm and soft. It wasn't earth. It was Beckett's scarf, soaked through. Ruiz tried to protest, but I yanked him hard over my shoulder. Ribs screamed. Something cracked. I heard it, felt it echo. I took 3 steps, stumbled, kept going. The way back to the fallback point felt like miles. Every tree had a voice, every branch a threat. I dumped Ruiz just behind a rock shelf and crawled back. Next was Beckett. He was drifting in and out. His chest had caved slightly near the collarbone, and he was mumbling about his brother's birthday. I told him to shut up and breathe. He tried, then coughed. Blood speckled my face. I didn't flinch, dragged him the same way. By then, my left side had gone numb, but my right hand still gripped my belt. One more. Blake. He was bigger, heavier, and angry. "You don't have to," he started. "Shut up and hold on." He wrapped an arm around my neck, tried to help, but I felt myself sinking under the weight. With every lurch, every step, I thought my ribs would splinter through my skin. One snap away from a collapse, one breath from blacking out. Then finally, I saw Michael's signal. One arm raised. The chopper wasn't down yet, but I knew we were close. I dropped Blake just inside the clearing, and then my knees gave out. My hands slipped in the blood pooling from my side. The sky spun. I don't remember falling, only the burn. And Blake shouting, "She's down! She's not breathing!" Then nothing. I woke up to the sound of machines. My ribs burned with every breath. The hospital room was sterile, too clean for what had happened. "Lieutenant Keene, you're stable," the nurse said. "You've been under for 48 hours. 48 hours, long enough for the story to be rewritten." I reached for the tablet on the bedside table. The preliminary internal investigation was already circulating. It was clean, too clean. No mention of the distress signal I'd sent when the ambush started. No mention of how our maps had shifted. Just a line that read, "Mission compromised due to emotional decision-making by lead officer." I checked the secure servers. The distress call was gone, wiped like it had never existed. And then I saw the signature on the authorization form. Walter Keene, my father. My throat tightened. He hadn't just signed off on the shortened report. He had validated it. I closed my eyes, the pain in my ribs sharp and raw, but I knew one thing, I still had my copy. The micro backup I'd hidden the night we returned was safe. No one knew where it was. No one would ever think to look inside the photo frame in my apartment, the one of Viper Echo's last training day, when we'd been young enough to think nothing could touch us. I could picture it clearly. The photo of Ruiz, Beckett, Blake, and me laughing as someone tried to teach me to drink their terrible homemade whiskey. I'd taken the frame down after the ambush. Couldn't stand to look at it. But I hadn't thrown it away. And that's where I'd hidden the backup. I didn't know how long it would take, but I would use it. Not for revenge, for truth. Because if I let them erase us, it would be like none of us had ever been there at all. They didn't need to say my name. The headline did it for them. Emotionally compromised female officer blamed for tactical loss. It was published first in a quiet corner of the Defense Press Network. A leak, they said. Nothing official, but it spread like blood on dry linen. Fast, irreversible. The article didn't quote me. It didn't quote my team. But it had just enough detail to identify me without ever using the word Olivia. It spoke of a female captain, recently returned from Cambodia, whose field decision jeopardized the integrity of the unit and resulted in 2 unnecessary fatalities and 3 life-altering injuries. My face wasn't shown, but my silhouette was. The photo had been taken mid-extraction, me hauling Blake across uneven terrain, face clenched, body bent, soaked in blood. The caption read, "Sentiment in combat, a cautionary tale." I read it alone in my hospital room. No one knocked that day. By noon, the Army's main press office hadn't issued a denial. By nightfall, a talk show on Channel 7 was already using my image as a backdrop to a monologue about women breaking down under pressure in elite roles. One retired colonel even chuckled. You don't send someone into fire if they're more worried about emotions than orders. He didn't know I'd followed. The damn orders. He didn't know I'd planned for the backup mic. He didn't know those men would be dead without the decisions I made. The next day, someone had cut a video together. Audio from an old training simulation layered over the real footage from Operation Viper Echo. My posture, my pace, the moment my knees gave out under Blake's weight, it was all twisted into a narrative of incompetence. The comments were worse. She should have stayed home. This is what happens when you promote based on gender. Liability in uniform. I thought about Beckett's voice when he begged me not to leave him. I thought about the color Ruiz turned before I got the tourniquet on. I thought about Blake, who still hadn't woken up. And then I saw the official website of the U.S. Army. There, right under the rotating header banners, was a Q&A section. One entry had been updated. Was there a command error during Operation Viper Echo? The matter is under internal review. Protocols regarding emotional readiness are under assessment for all leadership roles moving forward. No denial, no defense, just a convenient framing. The issue wasn't tactical, it was emotional. They were rewriting the story before I could finish healing. Even my inbox changed. One message from a lieutenant I trained 3 years ago simply read, "They're saying you cracked." Is that true? No greeting, no signature, just a question that pierced deeper than the shrapnel. And somewhere in that week, I stopped checking the news. But not before I noticed one small detail in that original article. The unnamed senior source who confirmed the incident. It didn't list him, but it used a phrase only one person ever used in my presence. Tactical command requires detachment. Sentiment is insubordination. My father. He hadn't just erased me. He'd rebranded me. And now the world believed him. I still remember the carpet in his office. Government gray, worn smooth in the corners. The color of resignation. The kind you don't notice until your heels stop just short of turning back. That day, I didn't turn back. He stood by the window, his back to me. The Potomac behind him, straight like his spine. He spoke first. Always did. I opened a door that would have walked you through history, Olivia. His tone wasn't angry. It was clinical, the kind he reserved for lectures at West Point. And you shut it without even knocking. I stood straight, my hands locked behind my back. I had rehearsed my answer too many times to remember which version this was. I don't want my name next to yours because of you, Dad. I want it there because of me. He turned, slow and deliberate. His eyes didn't soften. They scanned me the way a superior scans a soldier who just filed a questionable report. This wasn't about ego. It was about legacy. Ours. I stepped forward. You wanted a legacy. I wanted integrity. He, didn't move, didn't blink. You want to bleed in the mud with engineers and medics while someone else makes history with the pen I handed you? I want to earn the ink. That was when the mask cracked. Not his face, his voice. You think you're noble, but you're reckless. You're ungrateful. He turned back toward the window. There's nothing admirable about declining opportunity. It's cowardice dressed in principle. The silence between us swelled. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything he wouldn't say. Every damn time he taught me how to take a gun apart blindfolded. Every morning he woke me at 5 a.m. to run drills while the neighborhood kids slept in. Every smile he never gave but expected in return. I whispered, I'm not you. He didn't answer, just raised a hand, dismissed, and I left. But he never forgot, never forgave, because in his eyes I hadn't just betrayed tactics. I betrayed him. Months later in the jungle, as I dragged Ruiz through wet roots and the world spun from blood loss, I thought of that office, of that damn carpet, of how I had finally carved my own path, one rib at a time. But legacy isn't about bloodlines. It's about blood spilled when no one's watching. He wanted me to stand on his shoulders. I wanted to walk without someone else holding the map. He filed the paperwork. He omitted the signal call. He left me out of history because I refused to be his footnote. That's not how fathers act. That's how politicians do damage control. And somewhere between duty and DNA, he stopped seeing me as his daughter. He saw me as a decision that embarrassed him. And so, he erased me. My father spoke first, addressing the press with the same steady cadence he used in war rooms. She's my daughter, he said, but I do not show favoritism when standing before my duty. The chain of command exists for a reason. Lieutenant Keene made choices that led to unnecessary loss. The cameras clicked. No one questioned him, but I knew. I knew the story wasn't just being reframed. It was being buried alive. That night, I went home. My apartment was still the same. Too quiet, too cold, as if even the walls had decided not to take sides. I walked to the shelf and picked up the picture frame, the one of Viper Echo, the one I hadn't touched since the night I came back broken. I flipped it over, hands trembling. The back panel came loose with a soft snap. There it was, the micro backup, still nestled where I'd hidden it. I stared at it for a long time, feeling its weight, remembering why I'd chosen this place. No one looks at photo frames anymore. They collect dust. They become invisible. But not to me. I powered it up and checked the files. The entire radio log was intact, including the distress call and the timestamp that proved the maps had been tampered with before we deployed. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about stopping a machine that chewed up its own and called it protocol. The next morning, I filed for independent testimony before the Pentagon committee. When they heard me, they'd hear all of us. And this time, I'd make sure they couldn't look away. They gave me 20 minutes. I didn't need that long. The tribunal room inside the Pentagon was smaller than I expected. Quieter, too. Wood panels, brushed steel emblems, and a ceiling too high for comfort. 8 chairs on one side, 6 occupied. Brass, mostly. 2 civilian advisors, arms folded like gatekeepers to truth. And my father, centered behind the row. General Walter Keene. His insignia caught the fluorescent lights like glass under pressure. I stood at the center, hands clasped behind my back, in service uniform. I introduced myself clearly. Colonel Olivia Keene, Serial number 309-472-91-Kilo, presenting evidence in response to the recent claims of misconduct and emotional instability filed under Article 92. My voice didn't shake. I made sure of that. But my heart thudded like a slow drum counting something sacred. First, I played the transmission. It was scratchy, but unmistakable. My voice calling in coordinates. A static warning from the local advisor. Zone not confirmed clear. Risk factor yellow turning red. A pause. Then a muffled, barely audible, proceed anyway. Then silence. That same silence had haunted the official record, because none of this was included in the after-action report. I didn't look at my father as I pressed the next button, but I knew he heard it, because when I glanced across the room, I saw one of the Joint Chiefs lean back, arms dropping from their usual stiff cross. They weren't supposed to speak, but one of them, an older general with gray streaks running through his brows like war medals unpolished, whispered, "That line was red." They walked her into red. I stepped back, and then I did what no soldier ever trains for. I removed my jacket, slowly, hands precise, deliberate, no drama, no shaking. Then I lifted the front of my white undershirt just enough. 3 scars curved under my ribs like lightning trapped in the body. One long diagonal gash from a fragmentation shard. One jagged tear where the bone cracked and pierced through. One circular puncture where metal met tissue and didn't ask permission. The room didn't breathe. A pen dropped. Someone shifted. A throat cleared and then silenced itself. I lowered my shirt and rebuttoned the jacket with the same dignity I'd carried men across the jungle floor with. Beckett, Ruiz, Blake. And then I said it, not for sympathy, not for shock, but for justice. These scars are not the sign of a failure. They are the receipt of a promise fulfilled. I didn't abandon my men. I didn't collapse under pressure. I bled and kept dragging until none of them were left behind. My father didn't blink, didn't speak, but something shifted. His left hand opened slightly, fingers no longer clenched. He looked not at me, but through me, and in that gaze, I couldn't read shame, or regret, or pride, only something unsteady. Maybe it was memory, or maybe, just maybe, it was the first time he saw me not as a symbol of disappointment, but as what I had always been, a soldier who didn't comply, but never retreated. You'd think the silence in that tribunal room was the climax. It wasn't. It was just the match struck inside a closed hallway soaked in vapor. The day after I showed my scars, after I dropped the jacket, the truth, and everything I had left, Washington did what Washington always does. It whispered, loudly. At first, it came as backdoor nods. A captain I didn't know saluted me in the parking structure and said, "For what it's worth, ma'am, I would have done the same." A lieutenant colonel left a sealed note in my mailbox with only 4 words scribbled, "Maps aren't always right." Then came the leaks. Not from my end, but from theirs. The tribunal records, the redacted testimonies, the footage of my presentation. All of it began surfacing in military forums, leadership blogs, defense podcasts. Cable networks ran with it in their own way. One anchor called it a necessary conversation about emotion and ethics in modern warfare. Another wasn't so kind. They aired a panel of retired officers debating whether Colonel Olivia Keene had undermined chain of command by using battlefield discretion. My name started trending alongside words like mutiny, heroism, and worse, agenda. The Pentagon didn't issue a full statement. They rarely do. But the corridors had a rhythm. I could feel it on the way to the coffee stand near Corridor 6B. People stopped talking when I walked by, or they talked louder, hoping I'd hear. She disobeyed protocol, though, didn't she? I heard her scars were self-inflicted, like a dramatization. She dragged them out alone while bleeding. That's not a breakdown. That's leadership. It wasn't a conversation. It was a duel with fog. And somewhere in the mix, I saw my father's name appear. Again. A military ethics think tank posted a blog titled Keen versus Keen, when family loyalty disrupts structural integrity. They painted him as the bastion of rules, the unmoved general guarding the temple of discipline. They painted me as a ripple, a soft force trying to redraw the lines with sentiment. What they didn't paint, what none of them seemed to understand, was that my decision wasn't about heart over head. It was about instinct trained over years. It was about terrain over policy. It was about not watching 3 men die because the order said, wait, but the questions kept coming. Could the military afford to elevate someone who, even for good reason, broke chain of command? Could they afford not to? Was I the exception, or the beginning of a dangerous new precedent? Every step I took down the Pentagon halls felt like a test, not of loyalty, of worth. Not one room asked me what it felt like to pull Ruiz back while screaming through broken ribs. Not one asked what it meant to lose 2 men because we waited too long for clearance. They didn't ask what it took to silence pain so you could hear direction. They only asked one thing, in different words. Is there room in our doctrine for a soldier who breaks the rules and survives? And I couldn't answer that. Not yet. Because the truth was still unraveling. And somewhere down the hall, behind some polished wooden door, my father was still watching the same system I was now caught between, just from the other side. When the war quiets down, the voices that matter most often come from those who bled beside you. The first voice came from Beckett. I hadn't spoken to him since the extraction. He was the youngest on the team, barely 24, still had a baby face under the dirt and grime that day in Ratanakiri. On national television, CNN's veteran special, he sat stiffly, uniform pressed, eyes hollow like someone who'd learned too much too soon. They asked if he thought my judgment had endangered the team. He didn't flinch. I used to think Lieutenant Colonel Keene was just cold, hard, like she didn't know how to soften her voice even off duty. I get it now. That's what it looks like when someone's bleeding beneath the uniform and refuses to let anyone else carry the weight. She didn't lose control. She held the line, through pain the rest of us couldn't see. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, one of our field maps. She marked an exit route none of us saw. That's the only reason I'm sitting here. The second voice came from Ruiz. He had shrapnel lodged so deep in his thigh, the doctors said he'd never run again. But when I visited him at Walter Reed, he stood up on crutches and saluted. He never said a word to me that day. But 3 days later, a letter reached my mailbox. No signature. Just, you walked toward fire when I was crawling backward. If the Army questions that, maybe it's the doctrine that's lost its bearing. I kept that letter in my boot for weeks. Still do. Then Blake, the third man I carried out. I remember his breath was thin. He had punctured a lung, and I could barely feel his pulse by the time I got him to the evac site. We never expected him to survive. He did. But the trauma lingered. He didn't speak in public. He didn't do interviews. What he did was right. Blake, Beckett, and Ruiz co-authored a statement to Congress. It wasn't grandiose. No flowery language, just truth. We owe our lives to Olivia Keene. Her decisions, though outside protocol, were the reason any of us are alive. This isn't just about her career. It's about whether battlefield courage still has a place in today's military. But what shook me more than all 3 letters was the one that didn't reach me directly. It came through a friend at the VA, a veteran who had taken his own life after years of battling PTSD, had left behind a single-page suicide note. He'd written, "If someone like her had led my unit, maybe I'd have stayed longer. Maybe I'd have believed again." I didn't cry reading that. I couldn't, because it wasn't just a letter. It was a reminder of everything the tribunal room didn't want to hear, of what we lose when leadership is measured only by silence and salutes. They could debate tactics all they wanted, But these men, these voices, became the battlefield testimony they couldn't redact. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift, not in the institution, in me. I didn't even remember saying it, not until a clip resurfaced, grainy footage from 6 years ago, during our academy graduation. My voice was younger, less certain, but the words were mine. I stood behind the podium, in my dress uniform, my father sitting stone-faced in the front row. The cadet beside me had just delivered a clean, rehearsed speech about legacy and duty. Then it was my turn. They tell you that a soldier must never hesitate, that orders are sacred, but the battlefield doesn't always listen. If anyone in my unit falls, I'll drag them out, whether it's by command or against it, even if I break doing it. It wasn't a declaration. It was a promise, one I had nearly died to keep. The clip spread like wildfire, starting from a quiet military forum, then moving to veteran social pages, and eventually landing on the evening news. Journalists spliced the graduation speech with the image of me in front of the Pentagon tribunal, standing silent with rib scars exposed, the weight of command and condemnation hanging between those two scenes. A retired colonel tweeted, "We need fewer soldiers who follow blindly and more who bleed for their convictions." Dragged us out. The hashtag caught fire. Veterans used it to tell stories of commanders who carried them through hell. Wives posted about the unseen battles their husbands fought long after discharge. Even a former infantry medic from Fallujah wrote, "My CO once shielded me from mortar fire using nothing but his flak and spine. He didn't ask for permission, he just did it." Olivia Keene did the same, and for that, she's a soldier in the highest sense. Dragged Us Out started as a whisper of solidarity. But within a week, it was printed on protest signs, pinned on digital banners, and projected outside the Pentagon walls by a group of young officers. It no longer belonged to me. It belonged to every soldier who had ever carried another. Not because it was ordered, but because it was right. Inside the court, the air changed. Even the tone of questioning shifted. Less clinical, more personal. A female officer from JAG looked directly at me and asked, "Did you consider that your actions might cost you your commission?" I answered plainly, "I didn't consider anything but the blood on their uniforms and the sound of Beckett choking. You can write me off as a liability if you want, but my unit walked out of that jungle breathing." I didn't know then how many would echo those last 5 words. They printed them on challenge coins, on wristbands, on dog tags. She dragged us out. Not everyone supported me. Critics still called me reckless. A few generals behind closed doors worried about setting a precedent. But outside, in the hearts of those who had ever been carried, the precedent had already been set. I hadn't just dragged 3 men out of Red and Akiri. I dragged a whole conversation out of silence. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt like the mud, the scars, the tribunal, it had all meant something. It had spoken louder than the chain of command. I was already halfway to the exit when I heard the scrape of his chair. At first, I thought it was someone else. Maybe one of the aides or the clerk adjusting their seat. But no, it was his boots, military polished. He rose with the kind of stillness only a man trained to dominate silence could manage. The room didn't know how to breathe. I turned, slowly. General Walter Keene stood at attention, but not the kind I'd grown up memorizing from behind his shadow. This was different, not rigid, not theatrical, just still. And then he spoke, not to the Joint Chiefs, not to the record, not to the room, to me. "When I was a younger officer," he began, voice even, "I believed the mission of a father was the same as that of a commander. Lay out the route, clear the hazards, and make damn sure your people stayed on course." He paused, not for drama, for honesty. "But some missions belong only to the one carrying them. And fathers," He glanced down briefly before meeting my eyes again. We aren't always meant to walk ahead. Sometimes we're meant to stand at the edge of the ravine, watch our children cross through smoke and fire, and resist the urge to call it the wrong path, just because we didn't choose it. It wasn't an apology. It didn't need to be. Because in that moment, I realized he had never understood me less than he did on the day he called me a liability. But right now, standing in front of the Pentagon's highest ranks, he saw me, not as his failed legacy, not as a misstep in a career he curated, but as someone who had walked her own war and returned, not unbroken, but unburied. He looked over at the chair of the Joint Chiefs, gave a short nod, and instead of returning to his previous seat, 2 rows and a world away, he stepped forward and sat beside me. No declaration, no parade of reconciliation, just the soft creak of his uniform next to mine. Our medals didn't match, our scars didn't align, but for the first time in years, we occupied the same coordinates in history. Not as legend and disappointment, but as 2 soldiers who had both survived their own version of war. The tribunal didn't speak. Not yet. No one asked for clarification. No protocol was violated. But every person in that room knew something had shifted. Some unspoken legacy of silence, pride, betrayal had cracked. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. But I let my elbow rest lightly beside his. It was enough. That day, he didn't retract his earlier testimony, didn't issue a press statement. He just sat there beside me as if to say, "This time I'll walk with you, not ahead of you." And somehow, that mattered more than any correction ever could. The vote wasn't dramatic, no drum roll, no raising music, just hands raised, one by one, across a long mahogany table. Each motion silent, deliberate, irreversible, a unanimous decision. My Bronze Star with V device would stand. All administrative cautions struck. All insinuations of disobedience expunged. And then something unexpected. A formal recommendation from the committee to revise tactical coordination procedures, specifically the ones that failed to detect our distress signal that night in Ratanakiri. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like maintenance, like watching a bridge finally get reinforced after too many have fallen through it. There was no applause, no tears, just the same air I had learned to carry in my lungs ever since I first stepped into uniform. Dense, but breathable. The room emptied slowly. General Crawley leaned over briefly and said, "You didn't just drag them out. You pulled the rest of us forward, too." I nodded. Nothing more. My ribs still throbbed under the layers of wool and thread. Some wounds don't request your attention. They simply persist until you learn to carry them like medals. Outside, the press response was swift. Headlines read like battle flags. Pentagon upholds heroism in controversial case. Keene cleared. Protocols questioned. The lieutenant who pulled the war closer to the truth. Even the late-night shows softened their edges. That same talk show host, who once used my image for satire, now opened his segment with, "Turns out the woman who broke protocol also broke the silence." But peace is never unanimous. 2 days later, a quiet ripple disturbed the surface. An internal notice reached my desk. An anonymous complaint had been filed. It wasn't about tactics, not even about the chain of command. It was titled, "Misuse of Military Media for Personal Redemption." I reread it twice. The accusation wasn't direct. It was careful, crafted in the language of bureaucracy, lined with the velvet of plausible concern. But the subtext screamed, "She made us look bad." The complaint claimed that the circulation of my scars, the replays of the tribunal footage, and the overwhelming public support had blurred the line between duty and image management. They were right in a way. My story had traveled faster than any memo. My pain had been weaponized, sometimes by me, often by others. But it wasn't image I had sought. It was oxygen. It was clarity. It was the space to breathe inside my own uniform again. And now, even that was being debated. I didn't tell my father. Didn't want the truce to become a strategy session. Didn't want his voice over my shoulder as I read through the bureaucratic smoke. I filed a response the next morning. This wasn't a campaign. It was a rescue mission for 3 men in a jungle and for the truth they nearly died with. I signed it with my left hand. My right still ached too much to grip the pen. It wasn't over. It never really is. Not when you've been carved by both war and family. But for now, I had my name back. And my silence, this time, was mine to keep or to break. The rotunda of the Pentagon smells like discipline. Not sweat, not fear, just discipline. Dried ink, polished boots, and the faint echo of quiet footsteps on marble that seen too much and said too little. I didn't look back when the doors closed behind me. The vote was over. The headlines had already started forming. People were moving on with their lives. The institution had absorbed the blow and already started repairing its surface. But I wasn't walking away from a hearing. I was walking away from 17 years of silence, of calculated exchanges, dinner conversations that felt like chess games, and a father who thought molding meant chiseling off anything too soft. The sunlight hit just right through the courtyard archway. I blinked against it, and then I heard his boots. Not marching, not commanding, just catching up. I slowed. My chest pulled tight, not with panic, but with memory. He didn't call my name. He didn't ask for a word. He didn't give me another speech I'd have to dissect like a debriefing memo. He just stopped beside me, tall as ever, shoulders squared, wrinkles deeper now, as if shame had drawn its own battle map across his face. And then he did something I never saw coming. He opened his arms, not wide, not begging, just enough. Enough for me to know it wasn't a performance. Enough for me to know he wasn't reaching for his legacy. He was reaching for me. I froze. Every lesson about posture and strength screamed to hold the line, to keep walking, to nod politely and leave. But then I remembered something from years ago, when I broke my collarbone at the academy and he visited me in silence. He stood in the hallway with arms folded, never entering, never touching. That night I'd wished, just once, that he'd reached out. Now he had. So I let him. I stepped forward. Our uniforms scraped, metals pressed against each other. Bones collided where softness should have been. But I didn't flinch. Neither did he. The hug was brief, a steel-to-steel embrace. No sobbing, no cinematic music, no whispered forgiveness. But I felt something shift between our frames. It wasn't reconciliation. That word is too clean, too immediate. It was an agreement, silent and sacred. He held me not because I won. I stepped into him not because I needed to prove anything. It was something smaller, truer, that between two soldiers there can be something not spoken in commands or critique. There can be space. And in that space, sometimes there's grace. When he let go, he didn't look at me like a subordinate, or a disappointment, or even a daughter. He looked at me like someone who finally saw the whole picture and still stayed in the frame. He gave a slow nod, almost imperceptible. I didn't return it, but I didn't walk away either. We stood for a breath longer than protocol would allow. Then I turned toward the gates. My boots tapped against the stone. Behind me, his didn't follow. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking away from him. I felt like maybe, just maybe, he was walking with me. The headlines were merciful. Pentagon honors Keen after harrowing hearing. A daughter's scars redeem a father's silence. Closure at last. Closure. That word kept echoing through interviews, talk shows, even the late-night anchors who usually filled silence with sarcasm. They said I had reached it, that the courtroom hug had sewn up a decade's worth of fractures, that healing had arrived neatly, on time, like a final salute. But that's not how it felt. Not to me. Closure implies something has ended, and nothing about that day, or the 17 years before it, felt over. I didn't go back to base. I didn't go to any public event or follow-up interviews. I went home. Not the kind of home in military jargon. I mean my home. A third-floor apartment in Arlington, still faintly smelling of mint tea and old ambition. The place I used to come back to between deployments. The walls still remembered me. The closet didn't. I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months, pulled out a bundle of photographs I had wrapped in an old undershirt and tucked away after the Viper Echo fallout. I had taken them down when I started being called a liability. There was one with Ruiz pouring his weird jungle wine into a carved bamboo cup. Beckett was making a face like it was radioactive. And Blake, stoic Blake, was laughing full teeth, watching me try to politely sip without spitting it out. I remember the warmth in that moment. I had led them, bled for them. But more than that, I had belonged. I took out small nails and a hammer from under the sink. The plaster was old, but it still held. One by one, I rehung the photos on the hallway wall, each one an artifact of a truth that had tried to be erased, each one a page of a story no longer silenced. There was no music, no candle, no ritual, just small thuds of a hammer and the sound of breath that didn't tremble. My phone buzzed as I stepped back to look at the last photo, the one where Blake had his hand on my shoulder after we exfiltrated. Message from Blake. Scars don't make you a liability. They make you readable. I stared at that line longer than I care to admit. Readable. Not perfect. Not polished. Just understandable. Traceable. Like terrain you study before you drop into unknown ground. And I realized that's all I ever wanted. Not to be lionized. Not to be pitied. Just to be read correctly. I looked down at the faint bulge under my shirt, where the rib scars twisted quietly beneath cotton. Still there, still hurting on rainy days, but not bleeding anymore. The thing about wounds is, people think they close like doors, that once you face it, it disappears. But wounds don't close. They evolve. They stop being emergencies. They become markers, not of weakness, but of where strength was forced to grow. That night, I didn't write a speech. I didn't call anyone. I didn't scroll through headlines or read comments. I just sat on my couch, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around a pillow older than any commission I'd ever held, and I let myself exhale. Not because everything was fixed, but because, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't holding my breath waiting for permission to feel. A week after the hearing, I was in Philadelphia for a veterans panel. Low profile, quiet, not meant to draw attention. But attention had its own orders now. There it was, stretching across a red brick wall beside an abandoned factory. A mural of me, knees in the dirt, shoulder straining, one arm yanking a soldier out of an inferno, the other arm bloody and limp. Below it, someone had painted in bold white letters. She dragged us out. We drag her name up. I stood in front of it longer than I expected. People came and went. Some took selfies, some saluted, some cried. One kid, maybe 17, whispered to his sister, "She didn't quit." Look at her ribs. He pointed right at the mural's scar-streaked side. But further down the street, things weren't as quiet. Outside the federal building, across from the mural, a small crowd had gathered. They held signs too. Only these signs said things like, "Soldiers aren't feelings. Emotions kill missions. Stop the sympathy circus." A man in uniform, retired, judging by the stripes, held up a placard that read, "This isn't what the chain of command looks like." A younger woman stood next to him. Her sign just had 4 words. Don't weaponize your pain. I didn't approach them. Not out of fear, out of understanding. See, people weren't fighting me. They were fighting what I represented. To some, I was redemption. To others, I was an exception that proved a dangerous rule. Back at my hotel that night, I turned off all the lights, sat on the carpet, and checked my phone. The inbox had grown again. Hundreds of messages, some grateful, some cruel, some incoherent. But one had arrived in a sealed file packet. Untraceable. It was the anonymous complaint again. Same wording, same accusation. Violation of internal communications protocol. Exploitation of classified footage for public relations manipulation. No name, no sender. But the metadata showed something new. It had been opened, reviewed, then re-uploaded from an IP block tied to the Department of Military Public Affairs. It wasn't just still active, it was circulating. I leaned back, letting the carpet bite into my shoulders. My spine ached where scar tissue still stretched tight. My ribs throbbed from that long flight. Suddenly, a video autoplayed on social media. It was a clip from the hearing. Specifically, the moment when my father opened his arms, when I stepped into them. Only, in this version, it was edited, spliced with violins, soft filters. A voiceover whispered, "Even stage forgiveness feels good, doesn't it?" The watermark read, "Unfiltered Patriot Channel." The caption, "Daughter or PR asset." I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone across the room. Because part of me had expected this. Truth doesn't just win. It bleeds first. And people will always try to wrap it in a story they prefer. Later that night, someone DM'd me a different version of that same clip. Same moment. Same embrace. But this time no voiceover, no edits. Just raw footage. And a comment underneath. I don't know if it was real, but it reminded me to call my dad. And when I did, he picked up. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up to the mural again, shared on thousands of timelines. It didn't erase the criticism, but it reminded me, even if the system stayed silent, the streets were speaking, and they knew who had dragged them out. 2 months passed, not a word, no texts, no military channels, no fatherly check-ins disguised as logistics. Then one morning, just as I was finishing a run, my phone buzzed. Dinner, Thursday, 1900 hours. Tony's on 8th. No signature, no emoji. But I didn't need one. Tony's was the old diner near the academy. A hole-in-the-wall place cadets went when they couldn't stand the mess hall anymore. Greasy, loud, no protocol. I'd taken my boots off there more times than I could count. It was the first place I ever told him I wanted to be in uniform. But not in his shadow. When I walked in, he was already at the corner booth. Same table we used to sit at. His posture was straight as ever. Shoulders drawn back. Chin set like he was still in uniform. But he'd aged. Or maybe I just finally noticed. He didn't hug me. Just nodded. We ordered without small talk. He still liked black coffee with meatloaf. Still hated pickles. Still double-checked the receipt even though Tony's never changed the prices. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down. Not with a clatter. Just a soft, calculated pause. "I thought I raised a soldier," he said, "but I never asked if you even wanted to be a warrior." I looked at him, still chewing. The words landed. Soft, but not empty. There was something unraveling in the way he said asked, like he knew now that orders couldn't substitute for curiosity. I swallowed. "You don't call me a liability anymore," I said quietly. "That's enough." He didn't answer at first, just stared at the glass of water between us like it held a verdict. Then, finally, he looked up. Not like a general, not like a strategist calculating his next PR move, just like a father, one who had finally found the courage to remove his own armor. "You remember when you broke your arm? 9 years old, monkey bars." I blinked. "You didn't cry," he said. "Not even when they popped it back in at the clinic." He paused, and for a moment I thought he might laugh, but he didn't. "I thought it meant you were strong, born for this life. But now I realize," He tapped the table gently with one knuckle. It was never about being born for it. You just learned early how to bleed quietly. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was holy, like a ceasefire that neither side wanted to end. I poured us both more tea. Neither of us touched it. We didn't speak for a while, but something had shifted. Not fixed, not erased, but shifted. When the check came, I paid it. He didn't fight me. Outside, the evening had turned cold. He offered me his coat out of reflex. I refused it out of principle. Next time, he said, adjusting his scarf, we go somewhere with better chairs. You picked it, I said. Didn't say I was smart, just stubborn. It was the closest thing we had to a joke. We stood there for a moment under the flickering street lamp. Two people with too much history to hug casually and too much love to pretend that history hadn't hurt. Finally, he reached out. Not for a salute, not for a handshake, but just to fix the tag on the inside of my collar. He nodded once. See you soon, Lieutenant. Olivia, I corrected. He smiled then, a small one. Real. See you soon, Olivia. On the way home, I didn't cry, but I thought of that broken arm, the clinic, and how he held my hand even when I swore I didn't need him to. And for the first time in a long time, I let that memory be enough. When the official offer letter arrived, from the academy itself no less, it was typed on crisp stationery, signed by 3 decorated generals, and wrapped in gold-trim protocol. They wanted me to teach strategy, to mold the next generation of military minds, to become the face of modern resilience, as one line put it. I stared at it for a while, and then I declined. Not out of anger, not even defiance, just clarity. The truth was, I didn't want to replicate a system still struggling to hear its own echoes. I didn't want to stand behind a lectern and teach cadets how to win wars when we hadn't even learned how to heal from them. Instead, I accepted a different call, one that came without medals or uniforms. A nonprofit reached out. They worked with veterans transitioning out of active duty, especially those with PTSD, dishonorable discharges, or the ones who simply fell through the cracks of silence. I became a field advisor. No press, no podium, just circle rooms and stories. One afternoon, I led a session in a repurposed gym in El Paso. We'd stripped the walls of mirrors, too many ghosts, and sat in folding chairs. No ranks, no judgment, just presence. I was telling a story, not about strategy but survival, when I noticed him. Blake. He sat at the very back, hat low, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the faded outline of a scar I knew well. His leg bounced slightly. Not nerves, just memory. After the session, he waited. When everyone had gone, he walked up and asked, "Did you ever forgive him?" I didn't ask who him was. We both knew. I took a moment before answering. Number, but I stopped needing to judge him. Blake nodded once. Then he said something I'll never forget. Guess that's the difference between war and peace. The idea came on a Tuesday. No dramatic lightning bolt, no sudden epiphany. Just me, rereading my own incident report for the 100th time, and realizing how many names never made it to paper. So I created a platform. We called it the Rib Scars Project, a digital archive, anonymous and open, dedicated to stories that never passed the gatekeepers of official narrative. No names required, no photos needed, just the truth. Scars aren't liabilities, they're legible history, if we bother to read. The submission portal was simple. Tell us the moment they misunderstood you, and why you chose to survive anyway. We received hundreds in the first month. One from a nurse in Fallujah who was reprimanded for treating a wounded child during an airstrike. Another from a radio operator who disobeyed orders to stay silent because someone had to call for help. One came from a retired sergeant first class. He'd been discharged after violating a chain of command directive in Syria. His crime? Pulling 3 children out of a collapsing building during a bombing run. He never contested it, just went quiet. But in his letter he wrote, "I thought I was wrong for so long. Then I found your project. Thank you for reminding me I wasn't crazy for believing in decency." That sentence stayed with me. Not crazy for believing in decency. That's what the Rib Scars Project became. Not a protest. A ledger. For every quiet act of courage they tried to redact. 2 years later, I arrived at the hospital too late. The machines had already been turned off. My father was gone. On the table beside his bed was an envelope with my name in his handwriting. I opened it in the hallway, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been in years. The letter inside was short. "You didn't make me proud the way I imagined. You made me proud in ways I never dared dream." Behind it was a plastic sleeve, empty, and a note written on the back. "6 months ago, I retrieved the micro backup you hid behind the photo frame. I sent it anonymously to the committee. I knew you'd never trust my voice again, but I hoped you'd trust the proof." I pressed the paper against my chest. He hadn't saved me with words. He hadn't stood up in front of the cameras, but he had chosen to do the one thing that mattered. He had made sure the truth lived, and that was enough. I walked out of the hospital into the sunlight, the letter still in my hand. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the closest thing either of us would ever get. And for the first time in a long time, my scars didn't feel quite as heavy. If you've ever been called too emotional for caring, too fragile for speaking up, too soft for stepping out of formation to lift someone back to their feet, then this story was always for you. If your father once turned his back because you chose not to walk a path paved for you, but carved your own through thorns and silence instead, you are not alone. I didn't share my scars to make a point. I shared them because they were never meant to be hidden. They are not shame. They are the ink in the margins of a story the world tried to erase. This isn't a tale of victory. It's a record of survival, of loyalty that went unrewarded, of courage mistaken for disobedience. And sometimes forgiveness isn't about the other person. Sometimes it's the final kindness we grant ourselves, so we can keep dragging others out of the darkness, even when we're still bleeding a little ourselves. If you're carrying your own invisible shrapnel, if you've ever been told you're too much or not enough, please know you are exactly what someone needed, even if they never said it. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching this from? Is it a quiet morning with the warmth of coffee in your hands? Or is it late at night, when stories like this feel less like fiction and more like a familiar ache you've never spoken aloud? Tell us in the comments. I read every one, because I believe in bearing witness, even when all we can offer is presence. And if this story touched you, if it stirred something you thought had long gone still, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just for more stories like this, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, and in the strength it takes to try again. Thank you for spending your time with us today, for letting my voice sit with you a while. Wherever you are, I hope this story follows you gently, like a reminder that you're not broken, you're becoming. And sometimes the miracle doesn't bang on your door, it just waits patiently for the day you're brave enough to let it in. Take care of yourself, and until the next story, keep dragging others out, even if you break doing it, because that, too, is a kind of legacy. Olivia Keene.